A series is only as good as its major turning point, wouldn't you say? Even something that starts off as a boring slice-of-life story can become a horror movie if the turning point sticks to the landing. And when it comes to Berserk, there's no doubt in our minds that for most people, that turning point is the eclipse. But the eclipse we see isn't actually the one responsible for screwing up the Berserk-verse. That eclipse occurred 1,000 years before Guts was even born, and it changed the entire landscape of, well, everything. So, in today's video, we're going to be diving deep into the First Eclipse and breaking down exactly how the God Hand and the current state of the Berserk-verse came to be. We're excited about this one, but before we get too far ahead of ourselves, we do have a very quick request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to the channel. It's a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's get into it. Gaiseric versus the world. The basis for the First Eclipse. Most people think that Fantasia is a brand new thing, that this is the first time the physical and astral worlds have merged to this extent, and that this can only mean one thing, Armageddon. And most people would be right, but only on the Armageddon front we're afraid. The fact of the matter is that Fantasia used to be the default setting for planet Earth, and that's why humans have all those stories about giants, elves, and fire-breathing dragons. These mythical creatures once coexisted with humanity. It was during this age of magical abundance that a certain man emerged from the shadows. No one knew where he was from, or indeed how he raised an army big enough to conquer the entire planet, but they knew his name, Supreme King Gaiseric. Gaiseric is perhaps the most important figure in Berserk history whose life hasn't been explored nearly as much as it should, but we've received slivers of information about his reign, which is more than enough to help us reverse engineer history itself. For the longest time, all we knew about him was that he came out of nowhere and somehow unified every single warring tribe, clan, and kingdom into a single empire of man. Well, that and the fact that his enemies called him the King of Galloping Death because his fighting style was apparently quite ruthless. After Gaiseric's empire collapsed, it was divided into the nations and kingdoms that govern the Berserk-verse today, and though he didn't have any heirs, the Midland royal family claims to be descended from him simply because they rule over the heart of the empire. For the longest time, this was all the information we had on King Gaiseric and what the planet looked like when he ruled over it. But then, we reached Elfhelm, and many of the clues that were dropped between Guts rescuing Griffith from the Tower of Rebirth to when he got there with Casca started making a whole lot more sense. We'd always suspected that Skull Knight was Supreme King Gaiseric all along. Even putting aside the fact that his and Griffith's stories sounded similar to Guts the first time he heard them, the way Skull Knight handled himself and the revelation that Gaiseric's capital city was now sleeping within an interstitial space beneath the Tower of Rebirth was enough to make us suspicious. Elfhelm was just confirmation that yes, Skull Knight was in fact the person who once united all of humanity under a single banner, that he has been wandering the deep night for 1,000 years to undo whatever it was that happened to him. But what exactly did happen to him? That was never clear, even though we were given several hints, including the identity of Void, which we'll get to in a few moments. Things started falling into place when we saw the Wicker Man of Elfhelm and heard Skull Knight talking to Guru Gedford. They made more sense when we learned that Berserk's Vikings had once attacked Elfhelm in the distant past, and that Skull Knight knew not one, but two people from Skellig Island. The first one we've already mentioned. The second was a dwarf called Hanar, who made Skull Knight's current set of armor, as well as the Berserker armor, which is how he and Guts are connected. Once we had those pieces of information, we understood that Emperor Gaiseric most likely existed at a time when the world was in a state of Fantasia, but the God Hand wasn't exactly a thing. He had the ambition to unite all of Earth into a single polity. At some point, he attacked Skellig Island, aiming to fulfill his ambitions. He must have faced several casualties, because those are the soldiers whose armor Danon uses to help Casca train. Their souls are most likely what powers all the Wicker Men of Elfhelm. Instead of responding with tyranny and oppression, Gaiseric chose to become a part of the village, where he would hold regular town halls. Gedfring used to attend those town halls with his dad quite frequently, and it was probably after he became a staple of the community that the people accepted him as their own. Gaiseric fell in love with the Lady Priestess of the Cherry Blossoms, most powerful mage on the entire island, and he got some magical assistance from Elfhelm with his world conquest. Gaiseric donned the Berserker armor and set out with his troops from this region, where both space and time are distorted, made his way to the mainland to conquer it all. He earned himself a merciless reputation by using the Berserker armor to win his throne, and when he became king, he achieved his ambition. But when you've got nowhere else to go, there's no option left but to move inwards. That's what Gaiseric started doing. Over time, thanks to the stresses of ruling over such a vast territory and the negative influence of the Berserker armor, Gaiseric went from being a good monarch to a typical and terrible. He created a city in the center of his empire, which was as big as a nation, called it Midland. This is where the current current kingdom of Midland exists. According to fairy tales, Gaiseric worked many slaves to death erecting this monument, but we doubt that would have been necessary with all the mages he was surrounded by. The big difference between Guts and Skull Knight is that the former has negligible magical assistance in comparison. He hasn't even mastered the Berserker armor yet. Gaiseric presumably did, because he had to have fought his war of unification for several years before even taking the throne. Once he did, the legends say that his city became a corrupt den of sin, and that one day God sent his cardinal angels to cleanse Midland and Gaiseric with fire and brimstone. In a single night, his entire capital city disappeared, sunk beneath the ground, and the rest of the world was free from the Skull King's menacing hold. But we knew this wasn't true when the very chapter was mentioned because of all the branded corpses that lie at the bottom of the Tower of Rebirth. The tower is the oldest structure in the city of Wyndham. The current capital of Midland was said to have been built upon the grave of that ancient city. Many a king had sent explorers into the abyss at the bottom of the tower to find out what lay there, but none ever returned. The tower itself had been erected to erase Midland's quote-unquote shameful past, and that makes sense because we can't imagine the panic the discovery of so many sacrificed bodies would have caused. We've known since chapter 53 that Gaiseric's capital was the site of the First Eclipse, but what wasn't clear is what caused it. Clearly it wasn't him, because he was a part of the narrative at the time the chapter came out and an enemy of the God Hand. He revealed himself to Guts to warn him specifically about the eclipse because he sensed an ally in him. So if Gaiseric didn't cause the First Eclipse, who did? Why in the world would they take a whole city down with them? Well, here's where things start getting murky. The problem with the information we have on Gaiseric isn't just that it's scarce, it's also that it's quite conflicting. Early on in the story, we're told he was a cruel man who did something so insane that it led to an eclipse-level event. But after meeting Flora, that changes because she remembers him fondly. And then, reading through his interactions with Gedfring and Hanar, we learn that not only was Gaiseric a decent ruler at some point, he was also quite stubborn about fulfilling his duties. When Hanar sees him, he mocks him by saying he's a walking coffin. That's because any normal person would have just given in to their fate by then. But Gaiseric and Skull Knight continue to haunt the world, all because he wants to get his revenge on the person who destroyed his empire. So, what we think happened is that his reign as king of all mankind started off well. He made revolutionary changes to architecture, economy, science. Rickert was shocked to find things like fire extinguishers in Falconia, whose outer city was confirmed to be the remnants of Gaiseric's cap. But just because the physical boundaries between men are eliminated, that doesn't mean boundaries themselves don't remain. Gaiseric had brought everyone together, but governing all of them wasn't going to be easy because humanity isn't homogeneous. Every tribe and clan he united had its own culture, every kingdom and nation had its own laws. One polity with one ruler never works unless that ruler can maintain cordial relations with all of his subjects everywhere or control them through sheer terror. Gaiseric already had a reputation for being ruthless on the field, and it's possible that over time he became so obsessed with maintaining control that he started treating everything like a battle to win. That kind of thinking will quickly turn people against you, and it's why we think there's at least some truth to the claims that his capital was corrupt. The more you try to oppress people, the louder their voices become, until those by your side end up joining them as well. It appears as though that's exactly what happened to Gaiseric as well, because there emerged a certain sage who started preaching against his practices. This unnamed man is the reason that the world of Berserk is the way it is today, so let's now shift our focus to him and the relationship he had with Gaiseric. The imprisoned sages despair and desire, meeting the god of the abyss. In chapter 138, we hear a story about the sage we just mentioned. According to Father Mosgus, this sage made the courageous choice to voice his opinion of Gaiseric. For that, he was imprisoned within the Tower of Conviction. The city of St. Albion would have been a part of Gaiseric's midland, so this checks out pretty much, and what Mosgus says next is quite interesting. He says that the sage was tortured every single day, 6 ways from Sunday, and that each day he prayed to God for salvation. Finally, God heard his prayers and sent his angel to help him attain salvation. In the process, Gaiseric's judgment was also delivered. What is different about Mosgus' story and the fairy tales about the fall of the Skull King is the number of angels that were sent to perform those deeds. The fairy tales usually go for 4 or 5 angels, but Mosgus says angels singular. This solves the angel discrepancy because it implies that 4 angels descended and 1 angel ascended. And what we mean by that is that the sage Gaiseric imprisoned became an angel in his own right, just not the kind you'd write about in holy books. This is the story about how Void was born, because it's clear from the interaction Skull Knight has with him in chapter 88, these guys have history. And that's confirmed in chapter 362, which gives us the most important flashback in Berserk history. We'll get back to that in a few moments, because first, we need to talk about how the First Eclipse became a thing. To do that, Let's review how an eclipse is triggered. The key ingredients are a medium to commune with the astral world, despair and desire strong enough to want to change an entire planet, and personal relationships with so many people that losing even a single one of them would make you feel less human. Of all those boxes that need to be ticked off, the most difficult one is the last requirement, because it means that you essentially have to betray those closest to you in order to achieve your own dream. That's exactly what Griffith did during his eclipse, and it's implied that every other god hand did it as well. That means that the sage Gaiseric imprisoned and tortured was not just a random preacher, but one that he knew intimate, perhaps even his best friend. Such relationship dynamics make demonic rituals even stronger, so it's not really a question of if Mosgus's sage was Gaiseric's friend, as much as when did he stop thinking of himself that way. And the answer to that might lie in the degenerating morality of Gaiseric, like we mentioned in the previous section. Heavy is the head that wears the crown. These days, that's a cool album title, but the true weight of those words have made monarchs crumble under pressure. And pressure Gaiseric would have felt trying to rule all humans must have been so enormous that eventually his own people started feeling like enemies to him. What he did to this sage was wrong, and Gaiseric admits as much when he calls his eclipse flashback the end of a foolish king. But at the time, he must have deemed it necessary for the preservation of his legacy. As he was being tortured by this person whom he once considered his friend, the sage came to realize something truly profound. Evil exists in this world not because it wants to, because it is the nature of existence itself. What Gaiseric was doing to him was evil, beyond a shadow of a doubt, but it wasn't exactly because he had been possessed by evil. Evil is a thing that exists independently of humanity, and humanity is what gives it shape and form. The sage despaired over his condition and considered liberation from imprisonment so he could do something about this evil-filled world, and he was finally visited by the only confirmed god in Berserk. When that happened, he was presented with a choice, because we've seen that in this story, choices are often disguised as inevitability. In the Black Swordsman arc, the Slug Count was given a chance at a rare double ascension when he activated his Behelit during his fight with Guts. But because this ascension would require him to sacrifice his daughter, he chose to reject it, which packed his soul off to hell. The trick to understanding why the God Hand's so successful is to carefully analyze the phrasing of their words. They always say that the culmination of any demonic ritual must be contingent upon the ritual invoker's free will, meaning if they were forced to say yes, the ritual wouldn't work. Choice plays a big part in tipping things towards either side of the cosmic scale. It's just that the God Hand is so good at what it does that people often fall for their traps, think their fates are already decided. When this sage met the idea of evil, it explained to him that humans themselves were the cause of all the negativity that exists, and so whatever he chooses to do about his condition from that point onward would be fine with it. That's because the idea itself lives according to the will of mankind, so the sage's choices would become a part of it to reflect that same will. If he wanted to, he could have rejected giving in to the same kind of evil that he'd just been subjected to for God knows how long. The sage could have had a moment of clarity and realized that he was just being set up into becoming an agent of hell, but revenge took precedence in his mind because of what he'd come to understand of the concept of evil itself. It doesn't matter whether it comes from a friend or a foe, evil itself exists free of mankind and will continue to exist as long as mankind endures, perhaps even longer. It's a force that stands independent of its source, and so if evil will exist anyways, then he would rather become a part of it than reject it and suffer an even worse death. The sage probably was the first ever owner of a Behelit. When he reached the breaking point of his suffering, he snapped and activated it. When that happened, the aforementioned conversation with the idea of evil must have taken place because we don't actually see the first eclipse per se. We only get to see the consequences of its invocation, but it's clear that the sage accepted the deal. If the price of unifying all humans was to keep them in line by putting a thumb over them, then he'd rather do that as part of their unconscious mind rather than inflict misery upon them like Gaiseric did. The sage chose to become an embodiment of the cruel natural order of things, and in doing so, he triggered what we're calling the First Eclipse. The largest sacrifice known to date, the First Eclipse, and how it shaped Berserk. Like we mentioned in the previous section, a few things are required in order to trigger an eclipse. The first is the medium to cross over, which usually takes the form of a Behelit. It's not hard to imagine that the sage received that Behelit one day out of the blue. It also could have been plopped in front of him during the time he was imprisoned. Seeing this curious object, he must have reached out to it and touched it. Doing so, he activated it, most likely because he was barely clinging to life in the first place. When his blood made contact with the Behelit, his despair at having been betrayed and tortured by a friend and his great desire to transcend his mortal coil so he could bring about true universal change activated it. He then went on to meet the idea of evil, and in exchange for his new life as a member of the God Hand, he sacrificed the entire capital city of Supreme King Gaiseric, as well as everyone that was close to it. This resulted in the flashback we saw in Chapter 362, where a lone swordsman donning the Berserker armor cuts his way through what appears to be proto-apostles. In the background lurks a massive hole, pulling all of existence resistance into itself, and in the foreground, a massive closed fist appears. When the swordsman focuses on this fist, he sees four figures unknown to us flanking a man we've seen more of than we'd care to admit, Void, first known member of the current Godhead. The swordsman, aka Gaiseric, leaps towards this person who has become the source of his newfound misery, but he's stopped by the vision of his lover dying in his arms with a brand of sacrifice seared into her right arm. What this implies is that Void was close enough to her and the rest of Gaiseric's capital city residents because they qualified as sacrifices. Maybe he wanted to protect them just as much as the Supreme King did, but as time passed and Gaiseric became even more unhinged, Void's protective feelings took on a new shade. He no longer wanted to preserve the city that he quite possibly helped create. He certainly had no intention of letting Gaiseric's legacy survive. So, when the idea of evil told him to pile up the corpses, as it were, he obliged. And that's why we see so many corpses with the brand of sacrifice on their foreheads in chapter 53. Void offered up an entire city, thousands of people, to this new god he now chose to serve. In doing so, changed the landscape of Earth. What happened in chapter 362 wasn't so simple as a ceremony where people die to empower a single new entity. It was more like an eclipse and an incarnation ceremony combined. Do you guys remember how a massive, fiery brand of sacrifice appeared in St. Albion shortly before Griffith regained a body of flesh? Well, that brand is also present during Void's ascension, except it shouldn't be there. Eclipses take place within a dimension that's separate from the physical world. Incarnation ceremonies are the ones that take place in the physical world. So how did Void end up affecting the actual city itself? Because we know that he sunk it into the ground. Well, that's because his eclipse was special, being the first eclipse in all. Notice that giant gaping hole in the background when Gaiseric spots Void in chapter 362? That's the key to understanding everything, because that explains how magic and the astral world became so disconnected from humans in the physical world. When Void accepted the idea of evil's deal, he didn't just empower himself, he also agreed to become the herald of the Age of Darkness. This age would arrive in the future, but he still needed to prepare the path, and that started with cutting off humanity's access to spiritual powers. The reason we call the First Eclipse a combination of an eclipse and an incarnation ceremony is because while Void triggered the former, overall effects resembled the fallout of the latter. Chapter 362 clearly shows us entire blocks in Gaiseric's capital city being covered with demonic tendrils, implying that the city itself had been swallowed up by evil. It's after this ceremony concludes that the angel discrepancy starts being recorded in legends and fairy tales. What this tells us is that Void somehow received his transformation within the physical world and then separated the astral world from it using the power of the abyss. We say this because at this point in time, those two worlds overlapped one another. That overlapping is more or less condensed to the interstice. The interstice is a relatively shallow layer of the astral world, and one would require extraordinary amounts of power to access its deepest layers. This can occur at confluence points where a large enough group of humans gather a large enough concentration of emotional energy, but because magic was so commonplace at the time, practicing such access must have been extremely well regulated. That was until Void triggered the First Eclipse, which separated the two overlapping worlds entirely, turned magic into a taboo that needed to be exterminated. It was in the aftermath of the fall of Gaiseric's empire that the Holy See rose up as a dominant force. It's quite clear that this religion was manipulated by the God Hand all along. You can check out why we think that by watching the videos we've made on the topic, but the gist of it is, they became the main source of negativity and evil in the post-Gaiseric world. Both those emotions feed the God Hand's power. For 1,000 years, Void carefully selected his next four compatriots, whilst helping the idea create and proliferate apostles throughout Earth, and when the time was ripe, Griffith's eclipse took place and brought the cycle of evil full circle. Griffith traced Void's footsteps backwards, first becoming an intangible entity, then gaining a body of flesh, and triggering the great roar of the astral world so that Earth could become Fantasia once more. In a way, the current state of Berserk is a reversal of the original state of its world, and that's why the First Eclipse is such an important event that so few people talk about. It had the largest known demonic sacrifice to date, and it reshaped how humans thought of and perceived spiritual energy on a species-wide scale. It gave us the template for the monstrosity Griffith has become today, and its reversal is what created Fantasia. The First Eclipse is the true turning point of Berserk, and if you weren't thinking about that yet, well, you are now. Marvelous verdict. That being said, we've arrived at the end of this video, so as always, let us know your thoughts in the comments down below. The First Eclipse is a game changer among game changers, and we want to know what you guys think might have happened, what you think we've got wrong, if anything. Like, share, and subscribe for more Berserk content being injected straight into your feed, and we'll see you guys again real soon. Till next time, stay safe and remember the magic words. Keep on strugglers.